What's the beef? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Book with Ken Cameron of Corporate Culture Shift and Russell Stratton of Blue Gem Learning. What's the beef? Let's jump in. Welcome to Behind the Book, where I am your guide, Heather Andrews, unraveling the captivating stories from behind the pages. Join me as I sit down with authors from the literary landscape to delve into challenges, inspirations, and untold tales that breathe life into their written worlds. What's the beef? Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Book with Ken Cameron of Corporate Culture Shift and Russell Stratton of Blue Gem Learning. Previously, we had talked about another effing book and why good communication matters. So welcome back.
Good to be back.
Good to be back, yeah.
Excellent. You know, it was so long in between episodes.
I know we've made it. They haven't kicked us off so far.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. We'll see what happens this episode.
When we talk about good communication, as we did so much in the last episode, and the workshops that you do and how transformational there are, and then you fired it back on me and said why those workshops made me a better parent. We talk about mentorship. We talk about structure and formulas, which is kind of where this episode's going with what's the beef. And you also included what's the beef as the framework for your workshop in Culture Revolution. So can you just give us a little bit of background about what's the beef?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea by having it was rather than just giving people a blank sheet of paper and saying, have a difficult conversation. This is important. And they're like, well, where do I start? And even as Ken was saying in the last episode, you know, we could show the Bad Russell character. So if you don't know who Bad Russell is, watch the second episode, then you'll know what that's all about. As a starting point, but you need something else. So the beef model was a way for people to structure the conversation, a little bit like a checklist. Particularly as we would be working with people who not necessarily had a lot of experience of doing this, because they might be new into a management role or they've not had to deal with difficult situations before. So the beef model, first thing, was being clear about the behavior. So what's the problem? What is it the person's doing or not doing that's causing a problem? And being clear about that, okay, being specific. The second was first E, it was being example or examples. So being able to give somebody 2 or 3 examples that illustrate what you're talking about. Right. So there's an example to illustrate that. If somebody is persistently late and we need to be talking about timekeeping, then to give them some specific examples about on this date at this time, not, yeah, well, you're sort of coming to work late. And they go, well, when? And I can't remember when, but you have done. So be specific about that. The second E is the effect. So it's like, well, what effect is the person's behavior, again, what they're doing or not doing, having on others in the team or in your business, or for you as the boss. And this is really the secret sauce that we say to people, because people are very good at rationalizing away what happened or why it happened, but they can't when you start talking about the impact that it has on others. So again, using our lateness example, if you're persistently late for work and Ken's working there and he can't leave until you arrive, then he's always late leaving. And if that means that Ken gets home late, or he's late picking up his kids, or he's late, meeting his wife for dinner, then that impacts him. And until you realize that that's the problem, because the impact of what you're doing is having on Ken, that lands with people. And a lot of times people go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that me just being 10 minutes late for work has an impact on other people, not just, well, I can make the time up later. Okay, and the final stage is we need to make sure that we don't close off the conversation until we've discussed the future. So what is the expectation for the future? What are you going to do differently now to correct the problem? So again, if we use the timekeeping one, what's my expectation as your manager of how that's going to be improved going forward, and how am I going to hold you accountable?
Right.
So, we've got behavior, example, the effect, and what's the future expectation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really useful model because in our workshops, it's really helpful because it's only 4 things to remember, right? And we like to keep these things simple so that our participants can remember them when they're under stress. And having these difficult or challenging conversations at the workplace, whether they're about performance expectations like tardiness or being late, or not meeting their deliverables, or whether it's the even more fraught conversations around behaviors, right? Behaviors that we won't tolerate in the workplace, or behaviors that don't match with our culture. Those can be particularly fraught. And whenever those conversations are emotionally fraught, they can be emotionally dangerous and we can feel threatened. And so us as the leader going into those conversations, it's easy to forget what it is that you need to say. It's easy to forget where you are in the conversation. It's easy to let's just get this over with and move on. So having this really easy to remember template, and it really is only 4 words, just helps you to remember. Have I talked about the person's behavior? Yes, I have. Have I given some specific examples? I have. Have I talked about the effect? Oh, I haven't quite. So let me nail that. And then, okay, great. I'm so glad this conversation is over. I'm going to get out of here. Oh, except that I forgot to talk about what the future steps are. So just having that simple acronym and something that's so simple you can remember it when you're stressed out is really one of the key takeaways from all of our workshops and our writing.
Beautiful. That is absolutely very powerful. And I know when I read it, I was like, ooh, I gotta stop and pause here just for a second. Because I was reading it and I read through it twice and then I went and read through the conversations, and just the two integrated and taught are very powerful. And especially when you're looking to try to figure out how you're going to change how you communicate and that dialogue and be the communicator to lead that difficult conversation.
Right.
And it was just super informative for me to look at it that way.
Great. I'm glad it really resonated. Yeah, great.
When we think about Culture Revolution and your other book that you wrote, what would you say that you would want your reader to take away from your chapter in your book?
I think I'd like them to take away a sense of empowerment, a sense that I can do this.
Okay.
A sense that, it's not rocket science.
Right.
That it's something that I can actually implement right away. I don't need to study any further. I don't need to take any more courses. I don't need to, go away on a retreat and figure out how I'm going to do this. I can actually walk out of this office now and walk into a conversation and be able to remember these 4 steps.
Beautiful.
Yeah, very, very similar. It's just that practical, something you can take action now. It's not something that you can wait for next week, next month, next year, something you can do now. You could finish reading that chapter, put it down, walk out and actually do something different that is potentially going to have a different impact from what you've had before. That's the idea, really.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I know that that's part of your intellectual property, but it's so powerful. And when we think about culture revolution and culture in itself, I remember one of the very first questions that we asked when we launched the Culture Revolution book was, what does culture mean to you?
Yeah, there's so many different definitions of culture, right? Oh, you just rolled your eyes, and so you kind of share that with me, that there's a multitude of definitions around culture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's two of the most popular. One is culture is the way that we do things around here. Right, and another is slightly more complex. Is that culture is composed of the attitudes, behaviors, and expectations, as well as the policies and procedures and processes that we run through in our organization. And I like that definition because it brings together the notion that it's people and structures that kind of create a culture, and all of those are also too complex. And I really like for culture, I really like the definition that Chris McGough puts forward in the foreword to the Culture Revolution book, which is also contained in his book, The Primes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be found on his website, theprimes.com. And that definition is this. Culture is simply the line that separates the behaviors that we tolerate from the behaviors that we do not tolerate. I can sometimes put a nuance around that. It's the line that separates the behaviors that we expect from the behaviors that we don't expect. Yeah. Right? It kind of gentles it up a little bit. Yeah. But I really like Chris's firm definition that it's, we will tolerate this, we won't tolerate that. Yeah. We expect this, we do not expect you to do this. Got it. Right? And I find that really helpful definition of culture.
Well, it basically doesn't allow you to sit on the fence.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Which we can do that too often. I think
Yeah.
one of the real challenges and difficulties around culture, and I encounter this all the time, is that leaders will often say, "Oh, my company is only 2 years old. We've got to get the revenue flowing first before we. Culture's a nice to have, and we'll deal with that later." Or there's only 3 of us in the company, so we don't have a culture yet.
Right.
But in fact, I find both of those statements to be false. With only 3 people in the company, or 10 people in the company, or even only 20 people in the company, you have a culture.
Yes.
You just haven't articulated it yet. That culture has emerged, is in the process of emerging right now. We're just a startup. There's only 3 of us and we're only 3 months old. Well, you've already started a culture.
Yeah.
And it's already happening in the petri dish. And whether you want it to grow into mold or whether you want it to grow into bread is up to you.
Yeah.
Because you can either be intentional about it and it'll grow into bread,
Yeah.
or you just let it happen and it'll probably descend into something else. Or it could evolve into something really special and really nice and really
Yeah.
niche. And wouldn't it have been so much better if you had been intentional about wanting it to grow
Yeah.
into that niche culture?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. It made me think about, can we add wine to that bread? Anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Sorry. No, I'm not sorry. Yeah. Let's have wine and bread on that side. Okay, Russell, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, the thing I would look at it really was I think the culture is really the glue that keeps your organisation
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
And I think we talk about that in the chapter. It's sort of like having a model kit
Yeah.
that you build and spend hours and hours putting it all together, and then you don't put any glue so that the minute somebody kicks the table, it falls apart. And I think that goes back to your point, Ken, that people say, well, the culture will be as we build our business. Well, all of you can have the greatest strategy, you can have the greatest product, greatest people, everything will be wonderful. But if you don't have a culture that's going to make that happen and keep it together, then the minute you face any turbulence in the business world, everything can come crashing down. And I think that's the danger that business owners have by not focusing on their culture, that they're taking a big chance that the minute that they're not going to be able to weather out the storm, they're not going to weather out the next challenge because they don't have the culture that's going to keep that together.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Russell, because that was what you brought to that chapter. That was one of the things you brought to that chapter, was that illustration or that metaphor of culture and the glue. And in the chapter, you really you suggested we use the model airplane metaphor, and that really made it come to life. So I'm really glad you brought that up. You can tell who contributed what to the chapter, right? Because it's like, oh, Russell brought that up. That's my piece. I'm going to bring that in. I'm really glad you did, though, because it's a really great metaphor, and it worked really well in that chapter.
Yeah.
And what I particularly liked about the way that we chose to structure it, which we really did kind of together, it was really you that could use that model and how it might fit in, was the idea of having a leader who's building a model with their child, and then bringing what they're learning from their interaction with their child back into the workplace. And it ties into something we talked about in episode 2, where we talked about how what you learn how to communicate in the corporate workplace made you a better parent, and what made you a better parent helped you. It created this kind of virtuous cycle, and I think that's really illustrated in the chapter as well, right?
Yeah, well, I think it also illustrates that point that people don't, work is not in a vacuum. And then we glibly say, oh, well, people bring their whole self to work, and it's we got to they bring up what they learn in their work life is they take into their home life without really looking at what that actually means. And I think that example that we try to tease out there is that there's so many things that you can bring out for other aspects of your life that still make sense in the workplace, and also things from the workplace that you can bring into other aspects of your life. It's one of the things I talk about often with job seekers, particularly if they're new to Canada and they're looking at where's those transferable skills, and they say, well, what else have you done? I've never had a leadership position. Okay, have you ever led anybody or anything before? Like, are you a parent? Have you led a project on a fundraiser for your local church or your local hockey team? Oh yeah, I did that. Well, how many people did you have? Well, there were 20 people that I was coordinating. Okay, there's an example of leadership.
Yeah.
Just because you haven't done it with a leader badge doesn't mean you've never been a leader. So I think that idea that work and our non-work life do overlap, and we shouldn't be frightened about having those lessons sort of cycle round, as you say, Ken.
Yeah.
And it's worth picking up on, Russell, because so many of us try to separate and compartmentalize the way we show up at work and the way we show up at home, and they really can't be separated. And you've kind of alluded to that they can't be separated, but they also shouldn't be separated. It's very unhealthy to try to separate them.
Yeah.
We often find that the people who are in workplaces where they're obligated to leave behind significant parts of themselves can negatively impact their performance, and it can negatively impact the way in which they engage with their peers, but also has a really negative impact on their personal and physical and mental health, because they're leaving huge parts of themselves outside the door. Right? There's that Apple TV show called Severance, in which they actually have people like in this science fiction show, you actually are surgically forgetting your home life and surgically forgetting your work life. And it's like, and even in that show, they illustrate how that has a detrimental effect, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's worth just mentioning that you can't bring that part of yourself. And when we work with senior leaders at the C-suite level or at the CEO level, that's really interesting terrain, because often they can also be reluctant to be vulnerable at work and to being their full selves to work, or to describe some of their own struggles and failings in the workplace, because they feel that if they show any weakness at all, they'll be under attack.
Right.
And yet we often find that the opposite happens. And Russell, you've got a great story about this. Can I?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think it links into this idea. We want people to be authentic, and we talk about being an authentic leader.
Yeah.
Well, how can you be an authentic leader if there's two yous? There's a business you and there's a home life you.
Yes.
Like, people met you outside at, I don't know, the grocery store, and they would think it was a completely different person. Well, that would be pretty weird. The story you allude to, Ken, was some work I was doing with a senior leader, and they'd done a 360 feedback, and he was the first person to go through this in the organisation, and he thought, well, at this town hall, perhaps I should, give some, download some of the learning that I got from this 360 to everybody. But he said, I don't know if I should do that, because I pointed out a couple of deficiencies in as he saw it, in his abilities, and people are going to, exactly as you say, they're going to think badly of me, or they're going to think that I'm sort of weak and they shouldn't be following me. And I said, I don't think that's going to be the case.
Yeah.
Go and share it, see what response you get. So he sort of rather reluctantly, okay, well, it's on you. If this gets screwed up, it's going to be your fault. So he went and did this and told people, hey, there's some things I learned from this, and these are some of the things I realized I'm not doing as well, and perhaps I'm going to need some help from within the room. And he said, but afterwards, his other managers lower down the business, a number of people came to him and talked to him and said, thank you for doing that. It resonated with me. I felt that if you could admit to something you weren't good on, then I could admit to something I'm not so good on. You could ask for help, then I could ask for help. So it really started again back to culture, creating a culture that nobody was an island, nobody was perfect.
Yeah.
And if we were a little bit more open about where we were, where we needed help and asked for help, guess what? Most other people would say, hey, yeah, I'm happy to help you with that. I'm not really good at budgets. I love budgets. Can I help you?
Yeah.
Rather than, I'm not really good at budgets. I'll pretend that I am, and I'll just screw it up and hope nobody notices. Most people don't take advantage of somebody who says, hey, I could do with some help, because they might want some help from somebody else. So you can have that, reciprocal approach across the business. And surely we've got a culture where people are prepared to, muck in and help each other. There's got to be a better culture than when everybody sits there, isolated, just looking at each other.
This really relates to the chapter in the Culture Revolution book, because we in addition to talking about the beef model that we identified, we have a character in there who runs a business and who has to have one of these difficult conversations with one of his senior leaders, somebody in the C-suite that he brought into the company, who is treating another employee poorly.
Yes.
And the conversation that they have together is one in which the conversation is, this is a behavior that we won't tolerate.
Right.
This is a behavior that we don't want to see iterated. And there's a pushback from the other character in the dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And the pushback is like, well, at my company, this is the kind of thing we would do, and my company was much more successful than your company. But the CEO, his response is, that's not who I am. That's not the kind of company that we want to build around here and the kind of people we want around here. And so it really kind of goes to all the points we've been talking about in this episode around the fact that you can't really separate who you are at home from who you are in the workplace. You have to be authentic in the workplace, and you have to call other people into that authenticity as well with you. And if I just may, one of the things I also like about the chapter that we didn't really call out, but I just want to kind of identify here in this episode, is that what that character does in that episode is really important. He doesn't call out the behavior. But in so far as he doesn't accuse the other person and villainize the other person.
Yeah.
He actually does something that is the exact opposite. He calls in the other person. He isn't saying you have trespassed and you are now going to be excluded from the culture. He says, this is a behavior that we are not going to encourage around here, and I want to call you into the culture. And I want to invite you to change your behavior so that you can be more at home in this culture here with us.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important nuance that's really good for leaders to just be aware of and understand, because it can be a deciding factor in how your message is received in any conversation. That difference between calling out and calling in. There's far too much calling out in this culture. I mean global culture.
Yes.
I mean in terms of like what you hear on Facebook, what you find on social media. There's so much accusation, people leaping to accusation, people making assumptions, even within a workplace around, hey, you've done this to me and you're taking advantage of me, as opposed to engaging into a dialogue and calling the other person into what's your perspective. How is this is how it landed with me, what's your experience?
Yes.
How can we work together to reframe the way that we move forward together? Is a very different way of approaching a conversation, and as you can tell, I feel really strongly that we need more of that in both our workplace and in our society. Russell, you're nodding, so I
think 100%. You know, we have, if we broaden that outside the workplace, as a society, very much to make very snap judgments on small amounts of information, and then sort of label people as sort of weaponizing of identity politics. Well, you fit this demographic or this thought, therefore this must mean you think these things or you do these things, and not really getting an idea of, you know, people as individuals, and people can have a whole wealth of different, you know, approaches, different viewpoints, and just because they think X about this subject doesn't mean they automatically think X about a different subject. It could be something else. So, but we don't bother to ask, we don't bother to tease that out or have the conversation. If we just go in more accusatory, then we're missing that opportunity, and we don't really get to find out different people's viewpoints, which we find that we probably have a lot more in common than we think.
Yeah. And you touch on that a fair bit in our podcast. That comes up a fair bit in our podcast, and you're often using examples of how, you know, you and I could disagree, respectfully disagree, around a whole variety of subjects, from politics to social economics to a whole bunch of different things.
Oh yeah, but sort of joking aside, you know, Ken and I have done, we've done road trips. We've been from, you know, Calgary to Grand Prairie and driven that. We've been down to the States, you know, down to Philadelphia. We've been over to Toronto. We had a lot of time together over what we've known each other like 10 years. So it's a long, at least.
Yeah.
So a lot of time, and we don't necessarily agree on everything, on a whole raft of things. But I think what we've learned to do is listen to what the other person's saying to get a viewpoint as to why they think that. And sometimes they might go, oh, that's a good point, Ken. That reframes how I think. Or I might still think that's still my opinion. However, I now understand why Ken would see that differently. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong. It's just different.
Yeah.
And I think we could do with a little bit more of that in our businesses and society, that people can just have different opinions. Doesn't mean they can't work together.
Absolutely.
I'll never change my opinion on Tom Petty, though. I'm not. I'm immovable on this. I will not listen to Tom Petty on those road trips anymore.
Please don't get Ken on to talking about Tom Petty. Otherwise, that could be a whole nother episode in itself as to why he doesn't like Tom Petty. I actually quite like Tom Petty, but
Can we stop with the Tom Petty right now? No more of this. My skin is crawling already.
So basically from that, it's you model what you teach, and you walk the walk, and that is super powerful. And I know one of the things, just from what you all talked about, was I had to bring my healthcare management self into my business. And when I did that, that's when my business went like this. And what you share about the vulnerability and who we are, that vulnerability and that story and that experience really goes a long way with your 360 review, because it just emulates that courageousness and that boldness to share. And that's just that's that piece of inclusion and diversity today that we just need to, and that's why community matters. And you've given the solution, or a tool with What's the Beef framework. So where can people find you as we wrap up today?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn at Ken Cameron on LinkedIn, and make sure you look for the Ken Cameron that's described as the Ken Cameron, the shift disturber, because of my company, Corporate Culture Shift. Try to steer clear of Ken Cameron the astronaut, Ken Cameron the genre writer, or any of the other, it's a pretty popular name, any of the other Ken Camerons out there.
Perfect.
Okay, and similarly, LinkedIn for me, Russell Stratton, or known as the Leadership Champ. And you can find both of us on the website ineedtoeffingtalktoyou.com when we talk about our podcast, our book, our workshops, and various other stuff as well. So check us out.
There's relatively fewer Russell Strattons on LinkedIn, I've noticed. There's not as many of you.
Two S's and two L's.
Yeah, 2 S's and 2 L's. Russell Stratton. So look for that.
There is a Russell Stratton, an actor who doesn't do as good Bad Russell as I do.
No,
and
no,
again,
good.
Second reference to Bad Russell, you really need to check out episode 2 if you haven't already done so.
Definitely check that out, right? And also look for Heather's little breakdown in there where she's talking about her family background and stuff. And it's worth watching.
So you heard it. You need to check out episode 1, another effing book. Number 2, Good Communication Matters. And today, What's the Beef? And make sure you check out the next episode where we're going to learn what is next for Ken and Russell.
Prison.
As we close another chapter on Behind the Book, I want to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our wonderful authors for sharing their stories. I'm Heather Andrews, reminding you that the adventure doesn't end here. Keep turning those pages, and I will see you next time.